The frozen mud of the stockyard sucked at Rowan's boots, each step an effort against the clinging cold. He was a large man, built of the mountain that rose behind the town, his hair and beard a tangled brown mane frosted with his own breath. He was here for the two grays, a matched pair with strong backs and clear eyes, perfect for hauling timber out of the high country. The auctioneer, a rat-faced man named Finch, grinned with too many teeth. The price was agreed upon, coins counted from a worn leather pouch into Finch's palm. It was then that Finch jerked his chin toward the lean-to. A young woman stood there, motionless in the biting air. She wore a thin, pale pink dress, the fabric a ghost against the dirty snow. She was Chinese, her face a still, unreadable mask, her hands bound loosely in front of her with a length of rough twine. "Throw her in with the deal," Finch said, his voice slick with casual cruelty. "A bit of company for the winter." The men loitering nearby chuckled, a low, guttural sound. Rowan's gaze moved from the horses to the woman. She didn't flinch, didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on some middle distance, a place where none of them existed. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of the cold or the fear she had to be feeling. He looked back at Finch, his own face as hard and weathered as granite. That single, callous sentence hung in the air, an act of violence all its own. The decision was not a decision at all. It was an instinct, a line drawn in the snow that could not be uncrossed. That decision would cost him everything he had and rebuild it into something he never knew he needed. He took the lead ropes for the horses with one hand. With the other, he reached into his coat, pulled out his skinning knife, and walked directly to the woman. He didn't speak. He simply sliced the twine binding her wrists. The rope fell away. "She is not property," Rowan said, the words coming out as a low growl, steam pluming from his mouth. He turned his back on Finch's stunned, angry face and nodded toward the trail leading out of town. "Walk." The woman, Ann Jing, looked at him for the first time. A flicker of something, not gratitude, not yet, but a deep, unnerving assessment in her dark eyes. Then she turned and began to walk, her steps measured and sure, away from the stockyard and toward the mountain. Rowan followed, leading the two grays, the weight of his choice settling over him like a winter mantle. He could already feel the eyes on his back, the beginning of a pursuit he hadn't asked for, but had now invited. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the crunch of snow and the soft snorting of the horses. The journey to his cabin was a long, wordless trek up the winding mountain path. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, promising more snow. An Jing walked with a strange, contained grace, never stumbling, her gaze sweeping the terrain as if memorizing every rock and barren tree. She did not speak, not once. When they finally reached the small, sturdy cabin tucked into a stand of old-growth pine, smoke already curling from the stone chimney from the morning's fire, Rowan gestured toward the door. He unburdened the horses, settling them in the small, attached stable with fresh hay and water, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was giving her space, a moment to cross the threshold on her own terms. When he entered the cabin, she was standing by the hearth, her thin dress wholly inadequate, her hands held out toward the meager warmth of the embers. She was a fragile slash of pink against the dark, seasoned wood of his home. He ladled stew from the pot suspended over the fire into two bowls. He placed one on the small wooden table. "Eat," he said. It wasn't a command, but a simple statement of fact. She sat, her back straight, and ate with a slow, careful precision that suggested both immense hunger and immense control. He took a heavy wool blanket from his own cot and draped it over the narrow bunk built into the opposite wall. "You can sleep there," he told her, his voice rough but even. "You are safe here." She finished her stew, placed the bowl neatly on the table, and finally met his eyes again. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was acceptance, not of his protection, but of the terms of this new, uncertain space. He watched her for a moment, this silent, watchful woman who was now a complication he had to navigate. He saw the intelligence in her stillness, the way her eyes catalogued every detail of the room, the worn axe handle by the door, the stack of books on a shelf, the way the floorboards creaked near the window. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of observation. He understood then that he had not rescued a victim. He had brought a witness into his home, and her presence had already changed its very nature. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was now a safe house, a fortress with a garrison of 2 against a world that would soon come looking. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Rowan worked his trap lines, felled timber, and prepared for the deep winter. An Jing remained a silent, observant presence in the cabin. She kept the fire, mended his worn clothes with thread she'd unraveled from a discarded flour sack, and cooked with a resourcefulness that amazed him, turning his stores of dried meat and beans into meals that tasted of more than just survival. He never asked her what had happened, and she never offered to tell. He respected her silence, understanding it as a shield. But he also saw that it was more than that. It was a tool. One afternoon he was on the cabin roof, wrestling with a new section of shingles to patch a leak before the next heavy snow. The wind was relentless, tearing at his coat. He was tired, his muscles aching, and he'd misjudged the angle of a support beam. Below him, An Jing emerged from the cabin. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the fire pit, and on the smooth surface of a spare plank of wood, she drew. It wasn't art. It was a diagram, precise and clear, showing the load-bearing lines of the roof. She drew an arrow pointing to the exact spot where his new beam was placing stress on an old joint, a weakness he had completely overlooked in his haste. She held it up for him to see. He stared down at the drawing, then at the roof structure itself. She was right. Utterly, completely right. The fix he was making would have held for a week, maybe 2, before the weight of the snow would have brought the whole section crashing down. He climbed down the ladder, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He walked over to her, looking at the complex, accurate drawing she held. Her stillness, he realized, had been an act of constant, vigilant observation. She hadn't been cowering in his cabin. She had been studying it, learning its strengths and its weaknesses, just as she had studied the mountain path on their way up. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice low. She finally spoke, her own voice quiet but clear, with no hint of tremor. "My father was a builder," she said simply. She looked at the drawing, then back at him. Stillness was armor. Observation was the only weapon I had. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted permanently. He was the physical protector, the wall of muscle and mountain knowledge. But she was the strategist, the one who saw the cracks in things before they broke. He hadn't just saved her from Finch. She was now saving his home from his own oversight. The trust between them, once a fragile seed, had broken ground. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, blanketing the world in a suffocating white, the warmth of the hearth seemed to draw the truth out of the cabin's corners. Rowan was cleaning his rifle, the methodical movements a comfort. An Jing sat at the table, her hands tracing the grain of the wood. The question had been sitting on his tongue for weeks, heavy and unspoken. "Finch," he said, not looking at her. "Why did he have you?" He expected a story of abduction, of a random cruel act. What she gave him was far more chilling, a map of a rot that ran deep beneath the valley. "Finch is a dog," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He works for his master, a man named Bartholomew." She told him her father had been a merchant and a bookkeeper in a small settlement to the east. Bartholomew, a man who owned the bank, the freight company, and half the territory's politicians, had systematically ruined him with fraudulent loans and impossible contracts. When her father couldn't pay, Bartholomew forced him into indentured servitude, and when he died from exhaustion, Anjing became part of the debt. I was not a servant, she explained, her eyes meeting his, bright with a cold fire. I kept his private ledgers, the real ones. She had memorized them. Every name, every date, every parcel of land stolen through predatory lending, every water right diverted through forged documents. She recited a string of numbers and names, a litany of theft on a grand scale. Finch hadn't been selling her for company. He had been moving her to one of Bartholomew's remote mining camps, a place where a bookkeeper with a perfect memory could be silenced forever. He doesn't know what I know, she said. He thinks I'm just a girl in a pink dress. He doesn't know I can ruin him. Rowan stopped cleaning the rifle, the metal growing cold in his hands. He thought of his own family, of the small plot of land his father had lost to the bank years ago after a bad winter. It was Bartholomew's bank. The connection clicked into place, a piece of a puzzle he never knew he was a part of. This wasn't her fight anymore. It was theirs. The shared wound, the common enemy, solidified their partnership into something unbreakable. "What do you need?" he asked. Anjing looked at the small stack of paper he used for logging his timber sales. "Paper," she said, "and ink. We will give the truth a voice." The decision was made. They would not hide. They would fight. The cabin transformed into a command center. By the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Anjing worked, her hand moving steadily across the pages. Rowan watched, mesmerized, as she reconstructed Bartholomew's empire of corruption from the flawless architecture of her memory. Columns of figures, names of local ranchers and farmers he knew, dates of foreclosures that had been called misfortunes. It was all there, a meticulous record of systemic theft. The ledgers were more than just numbers. They were the story of a whole valley being bled dry by one man. They sat together at the small table, their heads bent over the growing stack of papers, a silent partnership forged in ink and resolve. One night, a frantic knocking echoed at the door. Rowan opened it to find his neighbor, Samuel, a wiry, decent man from the next valley over. Snow clung to his shoulders and his horse panted behind him in the darkness. "Rowan, you need to be careful," Samuel breathed, his eyes wide with worry. "Finch was in town. He's telling everyone you stole valuable property from him. He's offering a reward. The new sheriff, Croft, was with him, listening." The countdown had begun. They were no longer just hiding. They were being hunted. Finch's lie was a clever one, turning Rowan from a rescuer into a thief in the eyes of the law. "How much time do we have?" Rowan asked, his voice calm and steady. "Not much," Samuel said. "They'll wait for this storm to pass, then they'll come. 2 days, maybe 3. After Samuel left, a new urgency filled the cabin. Rowan pulled out his maps, spreading them on the floor. The direct route to the territorial capital at Prescott was too dangerous, watched and patrolled. "We go through the high passes," he said, tracing a finger along a treacherous, little-known trail. "It will be slower, colder, but they won't expect it." Anjing finished the last page of her reconstructed ledger, blowing on the ink to dry it. She carefully bundled the papers, tying them with a piece of twine. She looked from the papers to Rowan, then to the map on the floor. 2 days, she repeated, not as a question, but as a statement of their new reality. The planning was over. The flight was about to begin. The truth was now a physical thing, a weapon they had to carry through the wilderness before the jaws of the trap snapped shut. They left before dawn, the world a landscape of monochrome blue and white. Rowan led the way, one of the grays laden with their meager supplies, the other carrying Anjing. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that clawed at any exposed skin. Rowan's knowledge of the mountains was their only real advantage. He led them along ridges that offered cover, through dense forests that would hide their tracks, and across frozen streams to throw off any scent for dogs. Anjing was a revelation. She endured the brutal cold without a single complaint, her body swaying with the horse's rhythm, her eyes constantly scanning their back trail. On the second day, from a high vantage point, Rowan saw them, a line of dark figures moving slowly across a distant, snow-covered meadow. A posse. He counted 6 riders. One of them, sitting his horse with a ramrod straightness, had the unmistakable silhouette of authority. Sheriff Croft. That night, they risked a small, smokeless fire in the shelter of a rock overhang. The temperature had plummeted, and the threat of freezing to death was as real as the men hunting them. They were sharing a piece of dried meat when a sound carried on the wind, the distant, unmistakable jingle of a harness. Rowan smothered the fire with a handful of snow in an instant, plunging them into absolute darkness and bone-chilling cold. They pressed themselves against the rock face, listening. Hoofbeats, muffled by the snow, grew closer, then passed their position without slowing. They had been a hair's breadth from discovery. They remained there for over an hour, shivering in the blackness, until Rowan was certain the patrol had moved on. He felt Ann Jing shiver beside him, a deep, uncontrollable tremor. Without a word, he moved closer, pulling his heavy coat around both of them, creating a small pocket of shared warmth. It was a purely practical gesture, a strategy for survival, but in the silent, freezing dark, with danger just a breath away, it felt like something more. It was the first time he had touched her for any reason other than necessity, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability and their unyielding will to survive this together. After 3 days of grueling travel, they descended from the highest passes into a secluded valley Rowan knew from his youth. Tucked away at the far end was a small, fortified homestead, home to a woman named Martha. She was an old friend of his mother's, a widow with a spine of iron and a deep-seated distrust of authority. Martha opened the door with a shotgun held loosely in her arms, her eyes sharp and assessing. When she saw Rowan, she lowered the weapon, but not her guard. "You look like you've been wrestling with a blizzard, boy," she said, her voice raspy. He explained their situation in clipped, simple terms. Martha listened, her gaze shifting to Ann Jing, who stood silently behind him. The old woman's eyes softened with a flicker of understanding. "Bartholomew," she spat the name like a curse. "That man drove my husband into an early grave fighting over water rights. Get inside, both of you." She gave them hot food, fresh blankets, and a place by a roaring fire. While they recovered, she studied Rowan's map. "This trail is watched," she said, tapping a section with a gnarled finger. "Croft is no fool, but he doesn't know the old ways." She drew a new line on the map, a faint, forgotten track. "The old miner's trace. It's dangerous, but it'll cut 2 days off your journey and bypass the ferry crossing they'll be watching." The next morning, as they prepared to leave, a rider approached the homestead. It was Sheriff Croft. Martha met him on the porch, shotgun once again in her hand. "Morning, Martha," Croft said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Looking for a man named Rowan, and a Chinese girl he's taken. Seen them?" Martha looked out over her property, a picture of placid ownership. "Just me and my chickens, Sheriff," she said calmly, "and they ain't talking." Croft's eyes narrowed, but he knew better than to challenge Martha on her own land. He tipped his hat and rode off. Martha turned back to Rowan and Ann Jing. "He knows you came this way. That map is your only chance now. Go, and make that bastard Bartholomew pay for what he did to all of us." The miner's trace was barely a path, a treacherous scar clinging to the side of a canyon. It led them to a choke point they couldn't avoid, a deep, fast-flowing river that could only be crossed by a single man-powered ferry. And on the opposite bank, waiting, were Sheriff Croft and 2 of his deputies. They were trapped. The capital, and their only chance at justice, was just on the other side of that water. Panic was a useless luxury. Rowan looked at the steep, unstable rock face above the ferry landing. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root. He turned to Ann Jing. "You have to cross," he said, his voice urgent. He untied the bundle of papers from his own pack and secured it to hers. When you hear the sound, you get on that ferry. Don't look back, just go." She clutched the papers, her eyes searching his face. "What will you do?" she asked, the first question she had ever asked about his plans. "I'll make a door," he replied. He handed her the reins to his own horse, the stronger of the two. "Go to the landing. Wait for my signal." Trusting him completely, she did as he said, moving down the path toward the river. Rowan, meanwhile, began to climb, finding handholds in the frozen rock. He worked his way up to a precarious ledge directly above the road on the far side, where Croft and his men were waiting. He found what he was looking for, a series of large, loose boulders held in place by little more than frozen earth. Using a sturdy branch as a lever, he put all of his weight and strength into the task. With a deep groan, the earth gave way. A river of rock and debris thundered down the cliffside, crashing onto the road and blocking it completely. It was the door he promised. The sound was his signal. Down below, An Jing urged the horse onto the ferry. The operator, startled by the rock slide, began pulling on the rope to get away from the unstable cliff. Croft and his men were cut off, shouting in anger as they were forced to scramble away from the falling rocks. An Jing and the evidence were escaping. Rowan watched until the ferry was safely across. Then he turned to face the music, climbing down to meet the furious sheriff. "Just a man out for a walk," Rowan said calmly as Croft approached, his hand on his pistol. "Lost my horse. You have a warrant for my arrest, Sheriff?" Croft had a warrant for a thief, not a man on foot. He had nothing. An Jing reached the territorial capital. She walked not to the sheriff's office or a politician's door, but to the Hall of Records. There she found Clerk Davison, a man known for his meticulous nature and his intolerance for corruption. She didn't plead or tell a story of her suffering. She simply unrolled the ledgers on his desk. "These are the private records of Mr. Bartholomew," she stated. "They detail 15 years of systematic land and water rights fraud in the Western Territories." Davison, a man of paper and ink, recognized the truth when he saw it. The precision, the cross-reference details, the sheer scale of it, it was undeniable. He spent 2 days verifying a handful of the claims against his own public records. They matched perfectly, revealing the legal transactions as mere cover for the crimes. He acted decisively, using his authority to issue a series of court orders, freezing Bartholomew's assets and subpoenaing every man whose name appeared in An Jing's ledgers. The truth, once a memory, was now a weaponized public record. The victory was monumental, but the retaliation was swift and brutal. News traveled fast. Back in the mountains, Rowan had returned to his cabin, waiting. One night he saw it, an angry orange glow against the dark silhouette of the ridge. He knew what it was before he even smelled the smoke. He ran, but it was too late. His home was engulfed in flames, a funeral pyre roaring into the winter sky. Finch and Bartholomew's men had sent their message. As he stood watching the life he had built burn to the ground, Samuel rode up, his face grim. "They did this, Rowan. Everyone knows it. They think they can burn the fight out of you." But the fire did the opposite. It was a public act of violence that terrified the valley, but it also galvanized them. It proved that An Jing's ledgers were true. This wasn't just Rowan's fight anymore. It was theirs. People who had been too scared to speak up started talking, sharing their own stories of Bartholomew's quiet tyranny. The fire meant to silence them had instead become a beacon, calling them together. The destruction of the cabin hardened the resolve of the entire valley. The territorial court, armed with An Jing's undeniable evidence and a flood of new testimony from emboldened ranchers and farmers, began to dismantle Bartholomew's empire piece by piece. The law, for once, was working as a shield for the powerless, not a club for the wealthy. One afternoon, as Rowan was sifting through the charred remains of his home, a finely dressed man from the city arrived. He was a lawyer, an emissary from Bartholomew, sent to make the problem go away. He offered Rowan a heavy bag of gold. "A settlement," the lawyer said smoothly, "for your troubles. Enough to start a new life, far from here. All it costs is your silence." Rowan looked at the bag of coins, then at the blackened foundation of his cabin. He thought of Ann Jing's quiet courage, of Martha's defiance, of Samuel's loyalty. "There's a difference between a price and a cost," Rowan said, his voice low and hard. "Tell him I turned down silence." The next day Samuel arrived, not alone this time, but with a dozen other men from the surrounding valleys. They brought lumber, tools, and food. Martha arrived with a load of supplies, her face set in a determined line. They had come to help him rebuild. They worked together, a community rising from the ashes of one man's home, their shared labor a testament to their collective defiance. As they raised the first frame of the new cabin, a lone rider appeared on the path. It was Ann Jing, returned from the capital. She dismounted and walked toward him, her steps no longer just measured, but confident. She had a new dress, a simple one of dark blue wool, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had faced down a giant and won. She stopped in front of him, amidst the sounds of hammers and saws. The world of their shared fight fell away, leaving only the space between them. "I heard what happened," she said softly, "so I came back." "This is your home, too," he replied, the words feeling more true than anything he had ever said. She reached out, and her hand briefly, gently, covered his own where it rested on a new, unburnt beam. It was not a gesture of pity, but of partnership, of belonging. He looked at her, at the strength in her quiet eyes, and understood. He hadn't rescued her. They had rescued each other. Together, they turned back to the half-built cabin, its frame a skeleton of hope against the winter sky, ready to build their future from the ruins.